Propaganda is always obvious in retrospect. Today, you look at the posters, the films, the cartoons from World War II and the Cold War, and it's really clear what's going on. It's obvious. You see the emotions that are being played on. You see the symbolism of everything. It's propaganda, and it looks like it.
Americans don't give up. That's right. And I'm an American.
20 years after the start of the Iraq War, this is what the Bush years look like.
Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror.
An outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder.
The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Today, we know that Saddam Hussein never had WMDs. He wasn't responsible for the anthrax attacks, and he wasn't funding Al-Qaeda. All the justifications for the Iraq War that made it out to be a battle between good and evil, that convinced millions of Americans their army should invade another country, and that resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, were unfounded and spread, at times knowingly, by senior government officials and major news outlets. When we think of propaganda, this is what usually comes to mind. War and lies. Very attractively packaged discourse to get people to fight. But there's much more to propaganda than the flashy stuff. Propaganda can be, and actually thrives, when it's mundane.
So you're the heads of the US. You've grown comfortable with being the world leader for so long now that you view the US as untouchable. That unlike every other empire in the past, the US empire will never fail. Don't be silly. But then comes along these arrogant Chinese. Out of nowhere in a single generation, these foreigners went from being nobodies to racing to the top of the global stage near us. Their people are getting richer, they're starting to pass us on all sorts of economic indicators. They have so much more power and control over their populace compared to us that's almost unfair. In fact, no other country has ever risen so far, so fast, on so many dimensions of power that it's starting to make us feel rather insecure. They're outshining the master.
The biggest threat to America is not Al-Qaeda, it's not ISIS, it's not Putin, it's not any of these guys, it's China. You really believe that?
I believe it. I think it's the most consequential, existential threat, not just to America, just to democracy the world's ever seen.
Worse yet, you're well aware of what's called Thucydides' trap, where in the last 500 years, whenever there was a rising power threatening a ruling power, it ended in bloodshed 12 out of 16 times. Now, besides the people who profit from war, no one really wants to go to war. It's such a hassle. China has even outright said that it wouldn't win a conventional war with the US, but the history is there, and China has its eyes set on our throne. We have to be prepared for anything, including all-out war with China within the next decade. Now the naive out there will say that war with China is inconceivable, quit fear-mongering. And yet the most impactful events in history are often the most unimaginable ones. The ones where leading up to it, people said that would never happen. Stop being paranoid. And yet, our history books are just a series of wars and the shifting power that followed. Along with a few nice things that happen here and there, war is our nature. So in times like this, in the name of preparedness, Murphy's Law, just as a thought experiment, let's say we need to go to war with China. What would that process look like? Well, if we needed to attack China, theoretically of course, if we needed to deploy troops to destroy them and put them back in their place for threatening the master, the general public would never approve. They'd go all up in arms and protest because they would be the ones fighting it. We need to seduce them to the idea of a modern day world war. No easy feats. We need to make them believe that war is so inevitable, so inexorable, that the enemy's just waiting to attack us that, oh well, what can we do? We might as well just attack so we're not sitting ducks.
Rarely, if ever, does a war just kind of fall down from the sky. The foundation needs to be laid and the case is built, often with deception.
And what better way to get the public to buy into the bloodshed than with the time-tested method of war propaganda, just like how we've methodically used it time and time again in the past.
The war propaganda function is finely tuned, it's sophisticated, and most of all it blends into the media terrain. While the names of the countries changed, and of course each circumstance was different, there were some parallels that cried out for examination.
To preserve freedom and peace.
No one should doubt our desire for peace.
The United States wants peace.
We seek peace. we strive for peace.
As Americans, we like to think that we're not subjected to propaganda from our own government, certainly that we're not subjected to propaganda that's trying to drag the country into war.
Throughout human history, humans needed a way to answer the question of how should I conduct myself in the world to make the most out of their lives. So they used folktales, stories, myths, religion, books, and today, movies. And one theme that has stayed consistent throughout all these myths is the eternal battle between good and evil, protagonist versus antagonist, good guy versus bad guy. And the concept of good fighting evil is so ingrained in us, it's so primal to us that if you can activate it in people, they'll go to the ends of the earth. They'll do whatever they can to defeat evil.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Life and Life Only. This is part 2 of a 3-part series on propaganda, mostly focusing on the book Propaganda, Power and Persuasion by David Welch. If you haven't heard part 1, it would be a good idea to listen to it, but the episodes could work as standalones as well. Okay, chapter 2, the propaganda of nationhood and leadership. Now, another question, what is a nation? What is a country? What does it mean to you as you're listening to this? When I say that word, are you a patriotic person? Do you believe in nationalism? Do you believe your country's the best? They're just things to think about. The nation has been defined as an imagined political community and nationalism as a form of patriotism based on the identification of a group of individuals with that nation. This sense of an imagined community differs from an actual community because it is not based on everyday face-to-face interaction among its members. Instead, members hold in their minds a mental image of their community and the symbols, norms and values that bind them to it. Academic studies have demonstrated that a person's national identity stems from a myriad of common points in people's daily lives: national symbols, language, national colours, the nation's history, national consciousness, blood ties, culture, music, cuisine, radio, television, and so on. That sense of belonging and shared identity felt with other members is often foremost when the imagined community is under threat or otherwise pitted against another community, as in war or sport. And there's more on that, but yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Language is obviously the thing. I mean, if you, some people when they go on holiday, they try and avoid people from their own country. For example, when I was living in Laos, which is the first country I moved to, yeah, it was comforting to have people who spoke my own language, just because it's familiarity. And I think we all need a certain amount of familiarity, unless you're a complete maverick who just wants more difficult circumstances or ever-changing circumstances. Most people like a certain bit of familiarity. Now, there's a section here on the national anthem. Music lends itself to patriotic appeal since the latter depends on, at root, an emotional response, and music is inherently well suited to that. Unsurprisingly, then, national anthems appear in a wide array of contexts, from state funerals to sporting competitions, and by definition, they are compositions intended to evoke and eulogize, or at least encompass, the history of a nation. One of the most rousing in the Western tradition remains France's La Marseillaise. Its words and music were composed in 1792 by Claude Joseph Rouget de Lille, an officer in the French army of the Rhine. The new revolutionary government in Paris had just declared war on Austria, and as the army mustered in Strasbourg for an advance into the German states, the mayor of that city noted that they lacked any appropriate marching songs. So then he commissioned this officer to compose a song. I mean, the word anthem is obviously used also in pop songs. You know, I mean, Oasis are going to be touring again next year, and a lot of their music is anthemic. But national anthems, you know, I don't watch football that much, but occasionally watch England, and seeing those English players singing God Save the King, I always just think they have any idea what's done in their name. And what connection do, let's say, predominantly working class footballers really have with King Charles? In my discussion group I mentioned earlier, when Queen Elizabeth died, I did bring it up as a topic, and I noticed a little bit of defensiveness when I was quite disparaging about how important it was. a couple of people in the group said, well, my mum really liked Queen Elizabeth. And I do know people who've cried, because I was referencing a video made by a guy called James Hargreaves, who predominantly he's a guitarist, musician, and he makes videos about music generally. But for whatever reason, he was roused to make a video just saying that he couldn't find a single person in his area who cared at all that Queen Elizabeth had died. But yeah, it's that thing where people will sing the national anthem and have some, let's just say for argument's sake, a working class person, lower middle class person in particular, will somehow feel that the king is there on their behalf. Call me an anti-royalist, whatever, but I just cannot see that at all. Then we move on to flags. Historically, national flags originated as military standards, used as field signs worn on a combatant's clothing to show the difference between friend and foe, or a combatant and a civilian. The practice of flying flags indicating the country of origin outside of the context of warfare emerged with the maritime flag, introduced in the early 17th century, denoting a ship's country of registration. In the West, the rise of nationalist sentiment from the late 18th century transformed the status of the flag, and increasingly national flags were displayed in civilian contexts. The flag of the United States, the Stars and Stripes, was originally adopted as a naval ensign in 1777, and after the American Revolutionary War, it began to be displayed as a generic symbol of the new United States. The flag has become an extremely powerful symbol at home and abroad of the nation and of American values. They talk about Pearl Harbor, and there's a nice photo from the moon with an American flag planted squarely on the moon. Bill Hicks used to say stuff about the flag, and someone said, I died for that flag. And Bill Hicks said, that's funny, I bought mine for $2.50. Again, I'm not playing down suffering in war. I have a very strange relationship with war, because I think we're going to talk later, actually, about a famous cemetery in America. I have great sympathy for the troops. Just can't agree with war itself. But notice here, so the flags are connected with military, just as at least the French national anthem is as well. And yeah, it was originally used for identity. Literally, it's like physical identity, but now it's used for a whole other type of identity, a sort of wider identity. In fact, I think I'll just talk about that cemetery now, Arlington Cemetery. The thing about it is that you can't really argue against it, because certain people will say, don't you care that all these people have died? And yeah, I care about individual lives, but it's this commemoration of great battles and this glorification of soldiers. And I don't know if I've mentioned this before on this podcast, but in 2014 they had all kinds of programs, or it might have been 2018, I can't remember. It was either celebrating the start of the First World War, or it might seem strange celebrating the start of it, but whatever. Let's say it was celebrating the end of the war, but you're still effectively celebrating the war or commemorating the war. They'll all say on the BBC, we're all against war, but they'll still glorify our part in it, or some of our part in it. Of course, the thing that never came up, and I remember asking people when I was watching this on TV, is anyone actually going to tell us why this war happened? What good reason there was, if there's a good reason for war. Second World War, of course, you can use the fight against the Nazis to explain everything, to explain all our motives, and that's clearly not all our motives. Again, I'm saying our as the Allies. But with the First World War, I think probably Blackadder had the best explanation. It was just too much effort not having a war. Of course, that's meant for comic effect. But it's almost like the great powers just don't seem to be able to sit with peace. Now, of course, we haven't had another world war since 1945, but now what we have is proxy wars. I won't go into it now, but Vietnam arguably was a proxy war because the US was supporting South Vietnam, even though Kennedy, in fact, invaded South Vietnam in 1962, I believe. And China and Russia were supporting or supplying weapons to the North Vietnamese, same with the Korean War. So we've never stopped having wars. Just haven't had a world war. I just don't understand what they're celebrating exactly. Okay, if you believe the Second World War was all about liberation of the death camps, then why doesn't Russia get all the credit? Because they liberated Berlin and they lost tens of millions. Was it 30 million? I can't remember the figure, but it's just so skewed in our favour, and it's just so disingenuous. Well, let's move on. There's a section called The Propaganda of National Achievement. Stories about success are important in building or maintaining morale at an individual and organisational level, and also in sustaining the legitimacy of a state. They help build international support and, conversely, establish superiority over other lower achieving nations, and many a state seeks to speak through its achievements to these ends. Statements about achievements and celebration of achievement are thus among the most common forms of state propaganda, but they take on particular urgency during times of conflict and hardship. During the Cold War, scientific innovation and technological advances were seen as symbolic barometers of the strength and health of the US and Soviet superpowers, most notably in space technology. When the Soviet Union launched the first satellite, Sputnik, in October 1957, it shocked the United States, shattering assumptions about America as the technological superpower. It goaded the United States into a more aggressive stance in the emerging space race, which culminated with the successful moon landing in 1969. The Soviets, of course, got the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. I want to say 63. You can correct me if you want, listeners. It was the very early 60s anyway. 61? Yeah. There's a little bit of talk of world fairs and exhibitions. One of the earliest ones that's quite famous now is the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. It says, exhibitions and world fairs have provided a major opportunity for promoting national pride and achievements through demonstrations of trading clout, industry, art and knowledge. So again, the thing that's coming across here is symbology, things being symbolic. And in this case, they are showing you things that may well be real, real achievements. But it's all done to foster something that, as you said, probably exists to some extent. People do feel a national identity, but it's just pushing it a little bit further. Now, one of the more interesting exhibitions is described as the most politically volatile of the Parisian exhibitions, because they had various ones in Paris as well as London, occurred in 1937. It was already clear that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were planning to use the occasion for maximum competitive propaganda effect. Albert Speer designed an imposing German pavilion with two 23-foot statues representing family and comradeship, topped by an enormous German eagle with a swastika in its claws. Visitors were able to view Leni Riefenstahl's famous film of Nazi triumphalism, Triumph of the Will, 1935. Soviet Union, meanwhile, erected an equally imposing pavilion, topped by two workers brandishing the hammer and sickle. The 1937 exhibition was dominated by these structures, huge and deliberately symbolic, which confronted each other across the mall, pitting fascist ideology against communism. Of course, there was a point where the Nazis and the communists became allies, but then, of course, the Nazis invaded in 1941, I believe. So they've got an interesting history. By the way, Triumph of the Will was re-edited. I can't remember where I got this. I think it was a documentary about movie editing I was watching. And they were saying that this is interesting as editing, as propaganda, if you like. Footage is edited, and this obviously happens still today on the news, to give a certain perception, to achieve support for something, or to turn people against another group or person. And someone re-edited Triumph of the Will to totally lampoon Hitler, but they used all the same footage. I don't know if they included music, I can't remember the details, but they managed to make Hitler look like a buffoon. And we'll talk later about parody and satire. So you've got an exhibition, so you've got the Nazi symbols on one side, communist symbols on the other. And then I'm looking at a photo taken from it, and then you've got the Eiffel Tower slap bang in the middle. Interesting. Well, as I'm looking at this photo here, the German pavilion's on the left, and the Soviets are on the right. So that would go against, I suppose it depends which way you're looking, that would go against how they're considered on the political spectrum. But interesting, you've got the Eiffel Tower in the middle, in the centre of all the extremism, if you like. I'm sure that was deliberate as well. Now we move on to the Olympics. They mention about the Olympic Games and all the symbols there and all the propaganda involved. Perhaps the most overtly political and propagandist games in modern times were those held in Berlin in 1936. The Nazi government invested vast sums in them, believing they would provide an excellent test of Nazi racial theories. Meticulously stage-managed in order to maximise their propaganda potential, the Games brought a significant innovation. Dr. Carl Diem had the idea of bringing the Olympic torch from Mount Olympus itself. So in July 1936, 15 Greek maidens, clad in short tunics to evoke the priestesses' robes of ancient Olympia, gathered at dawn on the plain by Mount Olympus. The rays of the morning sun, reflected off a concave mirror, lit the torch, which was then conveyed by a relay of runners to Berlin. The imagery was unmistakable. Nazi Germany was claiming for itself the legacy of ancient Greece as a new home of civilization and defender of Western ideals. And there's a few more details there, but you have to wonder, so if the Nazis invented the idea of the torch, I don't know if the torch was used in the ancient Olympics, because remember the Olympics that we know from 1896 is the modern Olympic Games. I wonder why they're still using that, if that was invented by the Nazis. Anyway, and they mentioned from 1945 the Olympics became a stage for Cold War one-upmanship, though the Soviet Union only joined in as late as 1952 in Helsinki. There's some famous stuff from the Olympics, the Black Power salute in 1968. And then you've got the horrors of the Munich Games. Steven Spielberg made a film about that. And then in terms of the Cold War, you've got the Americans boycotting the Moscow Games in 1980 and then the Soviets boycotting the LA Games in 1984. So whichever side you're on, clearly the Olympics are a perfect breeding ground, really, for propaganda and one-upmanship to some extent. And they just make a mention of the Sydney Olympics of 2000 that, quote, marked the importance of the Pacific Rim to the world economy. An interesting choice of words there, because he's saying, it's not the importance of the Pacific Rim to the world community, but to the world economy. The costs of hosting the Games, with their lavish opening and closing ceremonies, have escalated incrementally. The opening ceremony in particular has become an opportunity for nations to propagandise their historical, political and cultural achievements, and the presentations have generally grown in scale, extravagance and complexity as successive hosts attempt to outshine their predecessors in terms of memorability. The mass choreographed opening ceremony of the Beijing Games reportedly cost $100 million and was watched by an estimated global audience of almost 1 billion people. London could not compete in terms of sheer scale, but instead opened the 2012 Games with a quirky multimedia narrative entitled Isles of Wonder, designed by the film director Danny Boyle. The ceremony, described in the British press as a love letter to Britain and by one newspaper as brilliant, breathtaking, bonkers and utterly British, celebrated with exuberance, humour and eccentricity the host nation's history, art and culture. When the Olympics came to London in 2012, I was in quite a strong activist period of my life. I was living in London, I was involved with activist groups, and I just found the whole Team GB thing very weird, and the opening ceremony was full of strange symbology. There was a very weird symbol, if you remember the 2012, looked a bit like Zion, and there was that one-eyed monster as one of the mascots. It was all just very strange and just absolutely dripping with often quite dark symbolism. Obviously, the newspapers were all over it. It's just British eccentricity, it's bonkers and everything. But just in conclusion, the Olympic Games it's almost like a festival of propaganda, really. My friends and I used to joke about the Commonwealth Games as well. I never really thought much about it, but if you think about it, the Commonwealth is all the countries that Britain colonised / brutalised. And it's quite strange to have them all in one Games together, if you think about it. If you actually analyse it and think about it, it's not what it seems at first. Like a lot of things, in fact. Of course, regarding the costs, I believe up to fairly recently, a lot of these stadia that were built and these arenas and what have you were often in disuse after the Olympic Games. All that money had been spent. Obviously, a lot of it is to promote the city, which was a big deal in the old days. Now, because of the global village and everything, you don't really need to promote your city as hard as you used to in the old days. But it was amazing, the cost. Obviously, the cost has gone up in terms of the numbers, but I'm not sure in real terms if the cost has gone up. And at least now these stadia that are built just for the Games are used after the Games has ended. So that's one good thing. Then we get to leadership, and we've got some familiar characters from the 20th century: Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin. I've already commented on the left and right, my scepticism with all that. And there's an interesting documentary. I think it's on YouTube. I'll put it in the show notes if it is. I think it's called Hitler and Stalin, Roots of Evil, and it talks about how their upbringings are very similar. I mean, this is not to excuse, it's only to try to explain where quote-unquote evil might come from. Most people would agree that Hitler, Stalin, whoever it is, didn't come out of the womb as a killer, and Hitler's father used to beat him into a coma. I think he beat him into a coma on multiple occasions. Stalin had a terrible father, physical abuse, emotional abuse, maybe other kinds of abuse, but they didn't go into it in this documentary. But it is important, I will always say, it's important to try and understand why things happen, rather than just this blind hatred, which is fostered by the media, for sure. You know, this dancing on the graves of killers and so forth. It's far better to try and understand it. They also mention Mao, who I did mention earlier, and there's a few posters and so forth. The Mao one, the caption says, Mao mythologized. A highly romanticized painting shows the young Mao Zedong, prophet-like in 1921, kindling the flames of revolution. I won't describe it to you here, but it's a very romantic poster with some of the usual tropes, you know, the flames of revolution. And Mao, of course, later instigated what was called the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. I mean, that's a perfect propagandistic term for something that turned out to be absolutely horrendous. I said earlier about the Little Red Book. People were apparently tested on extracts from the Little Red Book and then beaten if they couldn't recite it word for word. Also, there were stories of, there were radios, you know, like in old people's homes in this country, there are radios that are piped in, so they can't turn them off. You know, radios would be tuned to one station. I guess they were piped in so you couldn't turn them off. So you can't escape these propaganda messages. Aldous Huxley in Brave New World talked about sleep teaching. That's obviously a fictional novel. Some would say, how fictional was it? Did he have inside knowledge? I don't know, but society is clearly a mixture of Brave New World in 1984, the society we're in now. But yeah, in that one, babies are basically given, I guess, headphones, and all they hear is, I am alpha, I am alpha, I am alpha, just for hours and hours and hours. Their part in the higher part of society is just solidified by repetition. Then another baby would, I am beta, I am beta, I am beta. And if you think that, depending on where you live, you are going to be receiving these messages on a daily basis. So that's one way, is it's just propaganda by repetition. But yeah, you get these romanticized posters, and Stalin was always portrayed as a strong man, you know, a real man's man. The propaganda of personality cults may loom large in totalitarian states where leaders have sought to impose revolutionary ideas and change on a nation, but leader figures can assume extraordinary and charismatic impact in the history of democratic nations too. One only has to think of Winston Churchill's wartime premiership or the legacy of President Kennedy, revealingly referred to simply by his initials JFK. His hold on the American imagination was encapsulated in such phrases such as, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Or Nelson Mandela's reconciling leadership in post-apartheid South Africa. More recently, there was also the extraordinary public outpouring of affection for Elizabeth II during her Diamond Jubilee in 2012. Churchill was a consummate propagandist and notable wordsmith, but he is said to have preferred deeds to words. Again, the distinction is made that we're democratic and they're totalitarian, but at least the author here is, as I said right at the beginning, acknowledging that we do engage in propaganda as well. From Mussolini to Mandela clearly covers a lot of ground, but be they dictators of the right or left, or wartime democratic leaders, or the father of a new nation, all have exerted influence over the mass media in order to disseminate their propaganda and project their images. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but taken together, these examples are testament to the ways in which the modern state can become synonymous with the magnification of its leader's image. And that's the end of chapter 2. We're now on to chapter 3 of this book, of 6 chapters, and this is the propaganda of war. So propaganda really is seen probably in its most nefarious forms in terms of war. And that is a logical statement if you think of war as perhaps being the most nefarious thing in society. There are other terrible things around the world, of course. The fact that so many children in the world don't have access to clean drinking water, And the amount of deaths per day from preventable diseases is quite staggering. But war is one of those things, as I've previously talked about. There's an episode of Life and Life Only called War is a Racket. If you're interested in the topic, you might want to go back to that. War is something that is ever present in our lives. Can anyone remember a time when there hasn't been war? And we've already talked about it in this series as well. When we talked about leadership, the propaganda of leading your country into war is quite a large part of leadership, unfortunately. Certainly was in the 20th century, but as we've already discussed, although we haven't had a world war for around 80 years now, there are still wars and conflicts going on. And as I'm sitting here now, I mean, the situation in Gaza that we've seen over the past year is worse than horrendous. Anyway, let's proceed. So they start with a bit of history from the Crimean War to the Sino-Japanese War to the Boer War up to World War I. And they talk about the number of journalists covering these wars gradually increasing. I think we've already talked about Vietnam being a TV war, the first Gulf War being a TV war. As with most aspects of propaganda that are in this book, it's just an escalation. The amount of information available seems to go hand in hand with the level of propaganda. So, beginning of this chapter, one of the most significant lessons emerging from the experience of war in the 20th century was that public attitudes could no longer be ignored by governments. Unlike previous conflicts, the First World War, 1914 to 1918, was a, quote, total war, the first of its kind, in which whole nations and not just their armed forces were locked together in struggle, although the American Revolutionary War and Napoleonic Wars had foreshadowed this development through their levels of popular involvement. The world wars of the 20th century were markedly different. He's absolutely right there. I mean, now we think of the propaganda of involving the citizens in a war, and we saw this a little bit with the Nationhood to do with successes, and obviously success in war, or apparent success in war, is one of those things that is linked with nationalism as much as, victory in the Olympic Games. It might seem strange to compare war to sport, but they are both used in similar ways. Both the First and Second World Wars served to increase the level of popular interest and participation in the affairs of state. The gap between the soldier at the front and civilian at home narrowed substantially, in that the entire resources of the state, military, economic and psychological, had to be mobilised to the full. This was the logic of the new circumstances of total war. The statistics alone are telling. In the First World War, where, for example, civilians had their first experience of aerial bombing, 14% of war deaths were civilians. This increased to a massive 67% in the Second World War, not including the Holocaust. Quite amazing stats there. And of course that has gone up and up, and we're now at the point of perhaps 85-90%, depending on the conflict. Let's look at the First World War. For the British people, as for the people of other nations, the First World War was therefore a matter for every member of the population. In Britain, the introduction of conscription, the recruitment of women into the munitions factories, and the land army, Zeppelin and bomber raids over England, and the attempts of German submarines to starve Britain into submission, were all new, often traumatic experiences for a nation learning the rules of modern warfare against a popular European enemy. In such a struggle, civilian morale came to be recognised as a significant military factor, and propaganda began to emerge as the principal instrument of control over public opinion and an essential weapon in the national arsenal. The First World War still holds a unique position as the benchmark against which the heroism, brutality and futility of modern industrialised warfare has come to be measured. Once it began, the belligerents rapidly began publishing accounts of how it had been caused. They did so because the issue of responsibility was a key element in the propaganda battle. Propaganda was directed towards the home population to support the war, towards neutral countries as a means of influence, and towards the enemy as a weapon. The armies of continental Europe were made up of conscripts, and they really had little choice about going to war. In 1914, the British Army, by contrast, was much smaller and made up of professionals and then volunteers, and the government was not sufficiently confident to introduce conscription to prosecute the war. The British authorities placed immense reliance, therefore, on propaganda to justify the war to the people, to help promote recruitment into the armed forces, and to convince the population that their sacrifices would be rewarded. Immediately following the declaration of war on the 4th of August 1914, the British government, like all the belligerents, claimed that its actions were just, that it would be a short war and would be all over by Christmas. I think we've already touched on this, the promises that things would be short wars, and that's still going on, as I think I said in part 1. Yes, there are tales of people running to the recruitment office to put themselves forward for the First World War. You know, there may be various social forces that go into that. Well, I guess it was a badge of honour among people. Perhaps this might sound absolutely ridiculous, but perhaps it's not that ridiculous, that it was something, I don't want to say trendy, but something that just to be part of the group, you had to sign up for this. And I'm sure they were told that it was going to be glorious. I remember listening to an interview with the guy who wrote Jarhead. As a famous book about his experiences in war. This is much later in the century. And he said everything I'd been told about war, about how great it was going to be and how glorious it was, disappeared in the first 45 seconds on the battlefield. At the start of the war, most countries had only embryonic propaganda organisations. Institutions developed piecemeal, beginning as local initiatives that were later centralised as the war progressed. In Germany, the High Command established a supreme censorship office and the War Press Office to facilitate cooperation between the military and civilian authorities and to control the flow of information as tightly as possible. Information is power, folks. In Britain, 2 organisations were set up. At the Foreign Office, a news department had been established shortly after the outbreak of war to respond to the increased demand for war news from Allied and neutral correspondents in London. The second organisation was the Neutral Press Committee, formed under the aegis of the Home Office in connection with the Press Bureau, the government's principal wartime censorship organisation. Yeah, so power and censorship as weapons of war and in other areas, in fact. There's a lot here. On this page, he just carries on talking about this, and he also talks interestingly about using writers. With the help of some of the greatest writers of the day, and here's some names you may well have heard of: J.M. Barrie, G.K. Chesterton, Arthur Conan Doyle, of course the Sherlock Holmes stories, Thomas Hardy, H.G. Wells, Rudyard Kipling, there's others there, but they were the most famous ones, set about winning the hearts and minds of neutral opinion, particularly in the United States, the chief neutral target of Allied propaganda. The British campaign was almost invisible, deliberately targeting American elite opinion, where the British were able to exploit their common language, in contrast to the strident and public German campaign. So yeah, I suppose we're looking at different levels of how overt propaganda is and perhaps how crude it is, because that's another thing to be said about propaganda. There's a spectrum from very, very crude and obvious to very subtle and subliminal. And once again, hate to keep harping on this, but advertising is very similar in that spectrum as well. These writers that I mentioned, they were recruited, if you like, by Charles Masterman, who was the leader of the War Propaganda Bureau. And Masterman has been described as one of the inventors of 20th century propaganda. I talked in part 1, I mentioned Edward Bernays, known as the father of public relations. So there's clearly some seminal names there, establishing principles where all the rest of the propaganda really comes from and kind of expands on and develops. When I talked about victories for nations, and I mentioned war as a victory, of course, my own journey in terms of trying to understand war and my general anti-war stance comes from, I guess, being alerted to the idea that we're always talking about winning a war, but it's never really said that the best outcome would be to stop a war. I always found that strange, that it was always framed as whether you won or lost. But then somebody pointed out to me, well, stopping the war or curtailing the bloodlust, if you like, of the people that plan these wars, that could be to do with capitalism. I don't think there are necessarily evil men who just want to see lots of people die, but I think people have different levels. And in fact, in Blackadder Goes Forth, which is a fantastic satire on the First World War, the general says to Blackadder, "Don't forget that we're behind you." And Blackadder says, "Yes, about 30 or 40 miles. So the more distance there is, I think the easier it is to send troops out and tell them how wonderful it's going to be. and to not feel too many scruples about continuing a war, because obviously wars cost a lot of money, but in certain industries, obviously the arms industry is one, they are very, very profitable. So just to say that propagating and expanding and maintaining terribly destructive things like war is in the interests of certain parties, let's say. I'm saying this in a very diplomatic way. To me, in a war like, let's say, Vietnam, for example, I don't think there are any winners apart from, let's say, some of these industries. Even though America technically lost, I mean, they got driven out of Vietnam, they got driven out of Afghanistan after 20 years there. Whether you see that as a win or a loss, I think nobody really wins because of all the lives, the innocent lives that are lost. Right, they go on now to talk about the Ministry of Information, a centralised British propaganda organisation. The basic British approach, known as the propaganda of facts, was developed by which the official propaganda presented events as accurately as possible, but with an interpretation that was favourable to British war aims. Lord Beaverbrook considered propaganda to be, quote, the popular arm of diplomacy, in which the munitions of the mind became not less vital for victory than fleets or armies. I think we touched on that earlier. If you win the hearts and minds, then that's always better than the jackboot in the face. Now, one very interesting thing here, and this is something I learned from the book. You probably will have heard of the dropping of leaflets en masse, thousands of leaflets from planes into civilian areas with propaganda attached to them. But I always thought that the leaflets were dropped on the citizens of the Allies, of the country dropping them, telling them how well things were going. But there is a print here. I'll read you the caption. A British leaflet, 1917, dropped over German lines. It reports deteriorating conditions in Germany and quotes the Prussian hero Frederick the Great. Quote, I wouldn't have any soldiers if they began to think. Printed in German Gothic font, that's quite significant. These leaflets were extremely information heavy. This one also announces its mode of delivery. It's by balloon. A couple of things to say there. I didn't realise that propaganda arms used to drop negative leaflets over the opposition's civilian areas to try and, I guess, pollute, if you like. They would probably say they're just telling them the facts, the truth. But in another sense, they're polluting the minds of the citizens of their enemies. The other thing is that, as I'm looking at this, it's very, as I say, very information heavy. And I think the more information you have and the more official it looks, the less likely people are going to think that it's not true. Because they think, well, would anyone come up with something as elaborate as that? An information-heavy leaflet, with, what is it? We got something like 8 or 9 paragraphs of information here. Surely that can't all be lies. That's too elaborate. But who knows? I mean, the fact that there's a lot of information doesn't mean that a lot or all of it could be fabricated. What they're saying here, the propaganda of facts, as I said, is to do with essentially spinning true facts in the direction that you want them to be interpreted. Now, another thing, again, to do with involving civilians in war and making it seem like it's necessary for them to get involved and that their efforts are going to be rewarded or at least are recognised. There's a section here on home fronts in the First World War. Once it became clear in 1914 that the war would not be over by Christmas, it was imperative to remind people, both at home and in the trenches, of what they were fighting for. The major themes included a call to arms and a request for war loans, and efforts to encourage industrial activity, to explain national policies, to channel emotions such as courage or hatred, to urge the population to conserve resources, and to inform the public of food and fuel substitutes. The novel concepts of the home front were actually introduced in Britain in 1915. It was based on government intervention on a massive scale in order to restructure the country's economy and society for war, with corresponding sacrifices from the civilian population. There's lots of information in there. So yeah, encouraging industrial activity and encouraging, I suppose, industriousness in general to channel emotions such as courage or hatred. So you've got there a positive emotion, courage, and a negative emotion, hatred, and both can be used in different ways for propaganda. Once the initial euphoria, the war fever, had subsided, British recruitment posters changed in tone from the appeal to an individual's honour to mobilisation by shame. So there's a negative emotion there, shame, being used. A famous poster of 1915 depicted two young children asking their father about his military prowess after the war. "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" That's a very famous line. The emotional blackmail of using children to shame their elders into fighting was in fact employed by most of the belligerents. When he says belligerents, I think he just means all the nations that were fighting in the war. Women were also assigned the responsibility for ordering men into war. Another notable poster of the time asked women, "Is your best boy wearing khaki? If not, don't you think he should be? If a young man neglects his duty to his king and country, time may come when he neglects his duty to you." Perhaps the most well-known in the genre is E.V. Keeley's Women of Britain Say Go. And there's a print of it here. What's so great about this book, there's so much information in almost every paragraph, and it's presented in a very accessible way, and I hope I'm doing the same for you. But yeah, emotional blackmail, so using children, using women, it's almost telling women to nag their husbands in a sense. So using what could be called a stereotype of the wife nagging their husband. There's another interesting poster on this page of a 5-shilling note with a German underneath it. And it says, "Lend your 5 shillings to your country and crush the Germans." So the Germans being crushed by the coin, basically. Very interesting. So many different ways. As I said earlier, propaganda can be a very, very creative thing. There's some couple of pages or paragraphs about propaganda between the wars, between the two world wars. They mention Mein Kampf, it's a famous book by Adolf Hitler, and the fire at the Reichstag. The Reichstag was the German parliament building. I think it was officially put down to communists, but it's very interesting to me, since we've covered conspiracy theory on this podcast, that there are various conspiracy theories which are believed by some people that Hitler burned his own building down, a kind of a false flag attack, in order to, I guess, have something to fight against, making their enemies culpable for something that they may have actually done themselves. But it's very interesting that those same people who believe that would laugh at other conspiracy theories related to whatever it is. Not JFK, really. I think JFK official story is so dodgy that they don't even bother laughing at you if you question that. But, 9/11 moon landings, Princess Diana, etc. It's just interesting. I've said this before, I think, on the podcast, that when it's them, the Russians is another good example. When there's a suspicious poisoning in Russia, people are always very quick to blame the Russian government, whether it's Putin or anyone else. But it's just interesting that conspiracy theory is only really laughed at, or mostly laughed at, when we suggest that it's us, the good guys, doing it. Okay, let's go to the Second World War. The outbreak of a new global war would see the belligerent states employing propaganda on a scale that dwarfed that of all previous conflicts. Modern participatory democracies and totalitarian dictatorships had both emerged from the First World War, and among other things, the outbreak of hostilities in 1939 was a testimony to their mutual incompatibility. There followed a total war, even more all-encompassing than the First World War, as the figures for civilian dead confirm, reflecting mass societies, ideological and racial conflicts, and an even wider global reach. And once again, propaganda was a significant weapon. It was also arguably, from the Allied point of view, a morally justified war, thus invalidating humanitarian protest literature and art. So I made that point earlier, that the Second World War has a cause which everybody can recognise, that the Allies were fighting against. I won't keep making this point, but yeah, the escalation. As the wars go on, there's more information, there's more propaganda, there's more sophisticated weapons, and there's more civilian deaths. During the Second World War, authorities appropriated and controlled all forms of communication by means of strict censorship in order to requisition them for propaganda process. In the totalitarian states such as Italy, Germany, Japan and the Soviet Union, this posed a few problems, as the media, indeed the arts in general, had become part of the apparatus of the state. In the liberal democracies, on the other hand, the effort proved more problematic. Nevertheless, on the propaganda front, Britain appeared to be better prepared than in the First World War. A new Ministry of Information, that used to be called the Ministry of Propaganda, slight change there, had been mooted and planned for some time and came into being within a matter of days after the declaration of war in 1939. But when set up, it was to some extent making up for lost ground. Morale would obviously be a crucial factor in enduring civilian bombing or a war of attrition, and the MOI would have to compete with a German propaganda machine already in existence for several years under Joseph Goebbels. So what we've got here is the different sides trying to get a jump on each other as this new war starts. Whatever you say about Goebbels, and I haven't got lots of great words to say about him, he was quite gifted with propaganda. Now, there's a collection of more propaganda leaflets dropped by aeroplane during the Second World War by the Allies. The conflict saw a massive use of leaflets by all of the major belligerents. To be effective, leaflets needed and still need to speak directly in idiomatic language and readily understandable images. So let's just repeat that, because that is one of the hallmarks of good propaganda. Speak directly, use idiomatic language, and I would argue symbolic language as well, and have readily understandable images. Obviously, there's also a skill. We're going to look later at humour and parody. There's a skill to it. It's not just that, but arguably those are the three most important things. So let's look now at the Nazi propaganda. From 1942 onwards, Nazi propagandists were forced to shift their focus away from the original euphoria of the Blitzkrieg victories to account for a rapidly deteriorating military situation. The impact of the Nazi defeat at Stalingrad on the morale of the German people cannot be overestimated. It affected their attitude towards the war and created a crisis of confidence in the regime among broad sections of the population. Goebbels adopted a stance of frankness and realism by proclaiming total war, demanding the complete mobilization of Germany's human resources for the war effort and attempting to elicit a fanaticism to fight to the death against Bolshevism. I think we mentioned that earlier, didn't we, that the fact that the propaganda has to be adjusted and changed depending on how the war's going. If you can't fool the people into thinking we're still winning, then you have to change your stance. So Goebbels has got, as I said, frankness and realism, and then use of fanaticism. I would say that's one thing that was used more by the Nazis than the Allies. Now, let's talk about US propaganda. The story of US propaganda during the Second World War can be divided into two phases. During the period of neutrality, from September 1939 to December 1941, debate about the war raged among the population at large. President Roosevelt pressured Britain to specify its war aims, which it was slow in doing, but the result finally was the Atlantic Charter of August 1941, which prepared the way for the post-war United Nations. The Charter played its part in convincing the American people that the war was a noble cause and not just a bid to save the British Empire. Now, of course, the event that brought the Americans into the war was the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Once in the war, the US government mobilized a major propaganda effort through the Office of War Information and the Office of Strategic Services. That's the OSS, which is the forerunner of the CIA. The first having responsibility for overt or white propaganda, the second for covert or black propaganda. By 1945, the Office of War Information had a staff of 130,000 and a budget of 110 million per year. 110 million in 1945 per year. That's a decent amount of change. The United States used propaganda to orient troops, most famously in the US Army Signal Corps film series Why We Fight, directed by Frank Capra, and to motivate its civilian population. Later on, there's reference to the Yellow Peril, that's obviously Japan, and the Master Race, which relates to the Nazis. In all phases of war propaganda, the commercial media played a key role. At home, campaigns conceived in collaboration with the commercial media included an effort to engage women in heavy-duty war work. As you can see, we're getting some of the same themes used by different parties. Why We Fight, that series by Frank Capra, is reckoned by some people to be perhaps the most effective series of propaganda films in history. That's obviously arguable, but it's worth having a look at that. You might be able to find some of it online. I haven't watched all of it, but it is quite amazing. And Frank Capra, of course, you might know films like It's a Wonderful Life. We're coming up to Christmas, and I'm sure that'll be watched by a lot of people, probably by me as well. Capra had a gift for heartwarming stories, and he employed some of that gift. I mean, it's not a heartwarming series of films, but he's using his skill, I guess, in eliciting emotions, which, is a great skill in a film director. As we've already said, propaganda is an art form, and film is an art form, and it's got that visual aspect. Just very briefly, Japanese propaganda operated on three main fronts: domestically, China and Southeast Asia, and the West. Following its attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, as we said, December 1941, Japan had to fight on two fronts simultaneously in China and the Pacific. Official Japanese propaganda asked its people, already under duress since the 1930s, now to endure further economic restrictions, recycle scarce materials, make do with less, and live by slogans such as "luxury is the enemy." Intense propaganda campaigns directed at Japanese soldiers encouraged suicide over capture. So whatever you say about the Allies, I don't think they would have ever used that kind of propaganda. So it's different propaganda, partly based on established national characteristics or perhaps manufactured national characteristics. Now we get on to cinema. Just been talking about the Frank Capra films. By the outbreak of war, film had become the mass medium. In wartime, going to the cinema remained what it had become in the 30s, a normal part of everyday life, by far the most popular form of entertainment, particularly for the working class. It was, unsurprisingly, exploited extensively for propaganda purposes by all the belligerents. In Britain, where by the end of the war 30 million people were going to the cinema every week, the MOI, Ministry of Information, commissioned morale-boosting films, including documentaries exemplifying British courage or military prowess. Desert Victory, 1943, about the defeat of Rommel at El Alamein. Humphrey Jennings' exceptional body of work, including London Can Take It, 1940, about the unfolding German bombing campaign of the Blitz. And Harry Watts' Target for Tonight, 1941, about an RAF bombing raid on Germany. The commercial film industry, in conjunction with the MOI, portrayed many of the personal experiences of the war. That's another big thing, personal experiences. The task was to reconcile individual needs with the necessity of pulling together and to bring out the defining qualities of Britishness, such as stoicism and understatement, the famous stiff upper lip, and the sense of fair play. The result was a series of films about people from different backgrounds and classes successfully welded together for the fight against Nazism, such as In Which We Serve, 1942, Millions Like Us, 1943, The Way Ahead, 1944, and Fires Were Started, 1943. Now, I've seen a couple of those films, but not too many. I'm not really into war propaganda films. They just make me too angry most of the time. Now, crucial thing there, films about people from different backgrounds. As those in Britain will know, but people overseas will probably know this as well. Britain does have a class system. It's nothing like as strong as it used to be, but it's still there. Sometimes it shows itself very overtly. But yeah, conquering the class system. And one of the ways to do that, one of the great ways to do that is a common enemy. Suddenly everybody bands together. Next section is the Cold War and beyond. If the two world wars demonstrated the power of propaganda, the post-1945 period witnessed the widespread application of the lessons learned in the context of a communications revolution that now embraced television. When the expedient wartime alliances rapidly deteriorated into the opposing blocks of the Cold War, a new type of conflict emerged. This was a war on the mind, a contest of ideologies, a battle of nerves, which over the next 40-odd years was to divide the world into a bipolar competition. It was to be characterised by a battle for hearts and minds, there we go once again, but more sinister was underpinned by the threat of nuclear annihilation. The Cold War nuclear arms race focused much of the propaganda on national security and fear, two incendiary factors which led to the most extreme forms of xenophobia and to claims and counterclaims that gained in momentum. Frequently it was well nigh impossible for individuals to challenge prevailing assertions for fear of being labelled unpatriotic, or worse, a communist or capitalist spy. In the United States, fear of communist infiltration, whipped up by the accusations of Senator Joseph McCarthy and his Senate Investigating Committee, Spy mania and the knowledge that the Soviet Union now possessed a nuclear capability led to increased spending on nuclear armaments and intense and prolonged propaganda campaigns to inform the American public of what precautions could be taken in the event of a Soviet nuclear attack. So yes, it's a whole other ball game now. You've got nuclear weapons, so the propaganda is really ramped up, and probably the propagandists took more chances because they are relying on the fact that when people have been sufficiently scared by things like nuclear annihilation, which, depending on how long it would take for the warheads, for the whole process of using the warheads, it could be wiped out in an instant. And we saw, of course, in 1945, and the public would have seen by this time, because we're talking about the 50s really here, the McCarthy investigations, they would have seen what happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Hundreds of thousands of people wiped out in a few seconds. There's so much here, but we'll just read a little bit more about this. Propagandists on both sides of the Cold War divide used every available medium to sell an ideological view, and their contrasting interpretations of freedom and security to their own citizens and the world at large. The struggle tended to be represented in American propaganda in simple moral terms as a fight between good and evil. In the 1980s, President Reagan famously described the Soviet Union as an evil empire. It is important, though, to remember that on the Soviet side, the authorities always regarded language as a fundamental aspect of policy to secure Marxist-Leninist historical imperatives. Words as weapons in this ideological battle thus assumed an active and highly potent role in defining concepts such as peace, security, liberation, and freedom. That's a phrase worth remembering there, words as weapons. They then move on to the Korean War, which is pretty much known now as a proxy war. Again, the Chinese and Russians were supplying North Korea, and America was supporting South Korea. It says here, the Korean War in particular, that was started in 1950, I believe, gave a major boost to propaganda efforts on both sides. The US Congress tripled funds for America's propaganda campaign, and this is interesting here, called the Campaign of Truth, of course, enabling the administration of President Truman to intensify its efforts at home and to provide the Voice of America with the facilities to broadcast to more than 100 countries in 46 languages. The Soviet Union responded by improving its shortwave programming, so that by the end of 1950 it was able to reach more countries in more languages than the Americans could. By 1962, Soviet radio was broadcasting 1,200 hours a week, of which only 250 hours were directed at Western Europe. Accordingly, by 1965, the United States Information Agency's budget was substantially increased to counter this threat. The so-called Truman Doctrine, so Harry Truman was the president after FDR, of containing and rolling back communism proved sufficient for justifying the US presence in Korea, where the United States and its allies were, strictly speaking, fulfilling a United Nations-sanctioned operation to counter the North Korean invasion of the South. However, the Vietnam War proved more problematic from the point of view of propaganda. The US domino theory, in which allowing one state to fall to communism might topple others in turn, identified Vietnam as pivotal to the security of Southeast Asia. During the administrations of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, the US government gradually increased its aid to South Vietnam with large numbers of troops. They arrived in 1965 to combat the threat posed by the communist North Vietnamese regime and the Viet Cong insurgents it was sponsoring, which was backed by both the Soviet Union and China. Unlike in Korea, however, US propaganda failed to convince the American people that it was a just war or a war that could be won swiftly. It was the first war fought before a mass television audience, and the impact of this coverage on US and world opinion has been regarded by some as decisive. We mentioned that earlier, I think, and in fact, on my John Lennon podcast, Glass Onion on John Lennon, I've done a series called John Lennon In, and then looking at, I think, the years from 1962 all the way to 1980, in fact. I haven't done every single year, but I've done a decent amount of them, and a lot of it is about Vietnam, and I've talked about Vietnam even on that podcast. Yes, they learned particular lessons. It's very interesting how, despite their best efforts, they basically gave up on trying to persuade, coerce, propagandize the public into thinking that it was a just war. Of course, famously, Walter Cronkite, the distinguished and respected anchorman of CBS News, summed it up by asking in disbelief, "What the hell is going on? I thought we were winning the war." In fact, the American media did not necessarily become anti-war after 1968, as many have claimed. They merely became less willing to accept uncritically the official version of events. I could easily read all of this. It's very interesting stuff. The war fostered a powerful anti-war protest movement led largely by American youth who objected to the draft, to the nature and necessity of the war itself, and to the increasingly horrific images that were emerging. This movement, like the CND, that's the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in Britain, produced its own counter-propaganda calling for peace, a rallying cry that found a resonance among youth movements throughout the world. It also inspired a generation of musicians, songwriters, poets and journalists in Vietnam, the United States and beyond. The band Country Joe and the Fish recorded one of the most popular anti-war anthems in I Feel Like I'm Fixing to Die, the singing of which became a symbolic gesture of opposition and resistance to the war. And they just recite some of the lyrics. I talked about this on an episode called Blue Suede Truths, maybe a couple of years ago. And it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. The most fantastic lines of those are in, I think it's the final verse. He satirizes the advertising of the war.
And it's 5, 6, 7, walking up the pearly gates. Well, I ain't no time to wonder why we're all gonna die. Now come on, mothers throughout the land, pack your boys off to Vietnam. Come on, fathers, don't hesitate. Send your sons off before it's too late. Be the first one on your block. Have your boy come home in a box. All right, 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. The next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Walking up the pearly gates. Well, ain't no time to wonder why we all gonna die. All right.
Be the first one on your block to have your boy come home in a box. As I said, satirizing an advertising slogan, be the first one. You know, be the first one to own the latest, whatever it is. Now it'd be iPhone, of course. Hasn't really changed too much. But yeah, that's a fantastic song. The actual recording of it, the studio recording, I'm not that mad on, but the performance at Woodstock in 1969 is genuinely stirring. Okay, finally in this chapter, the disintegration of the Soviet bloc, which followed the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, brought to an end the Cold War. It was for a time accompanied by much promising talk of an end of history, a new world order. But by 1990, a new conflict erupted following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, which saw a US-led coalition, including Britain, repel the Iraqi troops. This first Gulf War also saw a heightened propaganda campaign shown live nightly on global rolling news stations, notably CNN. It was accompanied in Britain by a new wave of patriotic propaganda, again led by the tabloid press. The Sun, for example, ran a crusade termed Our Heroes, which encouraged the public to, among other things, proudly fly posters bearing the Union Jack, which the Sun provided. Now, don't get me started on the Sun. I cannot believe that anyone reads it, and it's still the most read newspaper in England. What we've got there in that last paragraph is really, it's almost like quite a nice summary of some of the stuff we've already talked about. When I say nice, don't really mean nice, but an effective summary. When the Berlin Wall fell and when the Soviet Union fell, it should have been, I think, an end of history. It should have been a new phase. I mean, I was only 15 then and I wasn't really politically engaged at all, to be honest. I was more interested in the sports pages. It is highly suspicious that America immediately just found a new enemy, and essentially terrorism took over from communism and has continued to be one of those highly effective, simple buzzwords that is fairly vague. We have some idea of what terrorists are, but that label, the same as the communist label, has been used in a highly simplistic and ambiguous way in a lot of cases. Right, I think that will bring an end to part 2 of this 3-part series that's getting longer and longer. You knew how this was going to go, didn't you, folks? If you'd like to help out the show, there are links in the show notes to Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal. And that will really be supporting my work across my 3 podcasts. So that's this one, Life and Life Only, Glass Onion on John Lennon, and Film Gold. And I'll be back with part 3 of 3, looking at propaganda. Till then, take care and goodbye.